Hi everyone. I thought I would start a new series up um, because I've been getting a lot of really positive feedback from all of you, and I just want to say thank you very much for all your support and kind words that you give me. Um, it means a lot to me, and I really appreciate it. So I'm at 69 subscribers. Woo! It's really exciting for me because I did not think I would get even that many um, by starting this. So it's very exciting for me that there are at least almost 70 people out there who think my channel is worth watching. So thank you. I appreciate it a lot. And I'm glad that you've all uh, continued to find the information on here useful and um, apparently fairly profound. So that's what I aim for. So in light of that, I thought what I would do, um, since I'm not sure how much uh, my blog gets particularly looked at, and also because I've kind of stopped. Well, I haven't. Well, the section on the majors I haven't updated in a long time. And I think, I got to the Hierophant and I found myself kind of confused, even though I have certainly a lot I could say about it. But I just was stumped at the time, so I kind of just gave it up. So in order to motivate myself back in, um, I'd like to start a series on all the majors here on the YouTube. So I'm going to take a card per video and talk about it. Now, y'all know I can talk, so this is going to be interesting. Um, so today we're going to start right at the beginning. And of course, I'm going to be using the Crowley cards just because they have the most symbolism for anyone to talk about. Um, I mean, Waite, of course, has a lot of symbolism in his deck, or rather, Pamela Coleman Smith has a lot of symbolism in her images. But for all intents and purposes, as wonderful as they are, those of you who have watched my channel throughout its evolution know my opinion on that deck. It is, especially when compared to Crowley's deck, love him or hate him. I'm sort of in between. His deck is, in my opinion, far more profound and far more symbolic, and is a treat to talk about and think about. So for the first video here, I'm going to start right at the beginning with the Fool. Um, where does one start with a Fool? Okay, so we're just going to go right through as many things as I can say about this card, and hopefully we'll get some kind of cohesive argument about it. First of all, I think it's important to remember that it is the path that goes from Kether to Chokhmah. Again, my Hebrew is very mediocre, I apologize. From Kether to Chokhmah, or 1 to 2 on the Tree of Life. Of course, if you want more information on the Tree of Life, use Google. um, find a good book on it. Dion Fortune's Mystical Kabbalah, really good. Or watch, one of my previous videos on the Sephiroth and all that, just to give yourself a basic idea if you're still learning about that stuff. Anywho, so this is the path that connects Kether to Chokhmah. Kether, of course, is pure consciousness. It is, in macrocosmic terms, it is the source, essentially the source of all life and all energy and motion. And on the microcosmic scale for the individual, it is essentially the kernel of spirit that resides in the individual, basically, and is the source of their life, is the source of all their motivations, and is the source of their existence, and is the reason for their existence as well. So the spirit is a very important thing, and it is inherently about motion. Chokhmah is, of course, the father in Kabbalistic thinking, and is associated with unlimited force, unlimited creative drive, and the idea really of just infinite, I almost want to say forward motion, excuse me, because it's about drive and really just pure willpower and not much else. You really can't. I mean, you can't say much about Kether or Chokhmah. Um, but it is particularly masculine. It's a redefining of active force. Okay, as opposed to Kether, which is kind of fluid because it can. I'm not going to go there. Not for this part, but the Fool connects those two Sephiroth, and I think what essentially we're getting at there is that the Fool has this infinite capability about him. He is also associated with the Ein above the Tree of Life, or the negative, the first veil of the negative, Crowley says. And he is called the spirit of the aether. He is also the element of air. So essentially, we have the idea of a vacuum. We have the idea of, I guess, negative energy, or I forget what physicists use as their term, but what is it, black energy or something like that? Gosh, terrible at this. But the idea that even nothingness has a sort of undefinable energy about it that is kind of unexplainable and very ambiguous, but it's still there. That there's energy contained even in nothing. So really, what is nothingness? It's kind of difficult to say. So the Fool obviously therefore represents unlimited potential, the ability to become anything, really. There is so little about him that is easily said as far as concrete anything, because he is not attached to anything. And this is why the Fool is associated with a certain stage of nirvana or enlightenment, um, because he has no attachments. He has freed himself from any attachment to materiality whatsoever. Or rather, not even free himself, because that implies that he was once attached in the first place, and the Fool can never be attached. And the Fool is essentially a representation of the Godhead. There's a sublimity to the Fool. Of course, the Holy Fool idea comes to mind. Der reine Tor, as Crowley says, from the German. And of course, he says, he talks about how the word selig in German, which means holy, is etymologically speaking connected to the word silly in English. So silliness and holiness are two sides of the same coin, in other words. So, and of course, not knowing anything and not really caring for anything associated with the world of men, so to speak, he is kind of foolish, or seemingly foolish. He's illogical, and there's an innocence to that is incredibly potent and fertile. This is why he's partially why he's associated with fertility gods, um, but also just general cultivation. If we think of his letter is Aleph. And the interesting Aleph is, of course, a very interesting letter, because Aleph is essentially silent. Aleph does not have a sound, really. Aleph is basically just a silent letter, unless it's paired with another letter, basically. So it's the idea of soundlessness and the idea of breath. Um, the Ein itself is represented as a circle, the zero, and it's eternal, but it's an infinitely zero, but it's a circle, basically. It's a cycle. And so with the Fool, we're also reminded of the breath. The breath itself does not really serve any purpose. The breath is only that which sustains life, and it doesn't really have any other codification, really. Breathing is breathing. It's very pure. Everything that lives does it in some fashion. Um, Either, even, and it doesn't have to be literal breath. Obviously, there are organisms that do not require oxygen or respiration. The idea is about intake and outtake and cyclical nature of life, that in order to live, um, that living thing must maintain a state of motion, and that motion takes place in cycles, basically. Um, so it is essential unconditioned being. Um, and so this is what we mean when we say uh, in the Old Testament how the ways of God are loftier than man's ways. Your ways are unknown to us, Lord, because they are much higher than our own, and we can't understand them. And it's true because, as soon as you speak from the position of human logic, you're coming at it from a logic that has been developed through experience and experience of materiality and cause and effect. The fool has no understanding of cause and effect or materiality or experience. The fool has experienced nothing really. Um, and this is why we have to take this journey through down the Sephiroth, through all the other majors to get to the universe. In some ways, you have to talk about the two together because they both really represent the same thing. Just one is at the beginning, the Alpha, and the other is the Omega, the Tau of the Hebrew alphabet. And the universe is really the fool having actually experienced something, returning into reintegrating himself into the idea of nothingness and returning sort of developed in a bizarre way. Even though it is nothingness, it has become something different through the role of experience, and yet it is still purely nothing and still virginally innocent. It can never be exhausted and can never be spent or penetrated really. So of course these are really deep ideas. I'm not sure how well I'm explaining them, but the idea is, I think, non-attachment to all things. So let's see, is there anything else I can say about this? Well, another important thing about him is that he is associated with uh, Dionysus a lot and Bacchus. As you can see, uh, there's a little patch of grapes, a little, whatever the heck the word is, bundle of grapes is what I'm going to say. Stem of grapes, and bunch, that's what I want. See, it's a little late, sorry. There's a bunch of grapes that he's holding over his shoulder or something like that. And you can actually see the leaf of the vine, sorry, here. And the vine actually wraps around him and makes a circle around his heart. And this is about the idea of divine intoxication. The divine intoxication, okay. The idea that when overwhelmed by the Spirit, one is completely lost in it. And again, there is only pure consciousness, and there's a delight in that, and an ecstasy in all things. It's the vision of the universe as pure joy as opposed to pure sorrow. That life itself and existence itself is entirely happiness. It's the bliss of paradise, really. But at the same time, it's at such a lofty degree, and it's really talking about life in its highest aspect, I think. Because, of course, I think Buddha was right when we say that manifested life or existence in the body is a life full of suffering. And that's what the Three of Swords is kind of getting at, as I may talk about if I decide to do a bunch of series on the minors. Um, but I think the Fool is telling us that life is a lot more humorous than we might think. That life at its loftiest is really just a big joke. Because the idea is that God the Creator, if He is indeed everything, is the sum total of His creation and also transcends His creation because nothing may contain Him. If that is the case, then and if God is perfect, then God does not need anything else. There is no reason to existence, because to presuppose a reason for existence or for God's creation would mean that God needs something, that God has a purpose. For God to have a purpose, it presupposes God needing something to be accomplished. When God is perfect, God does not need anything to be accomplished. This is kind of an aspect of Hindu philosophy that we're getting at. But the idea that God is immutable, God, you can't add anything to God, you can't take away anything from God. So why then do you need to make existence in order to, to do what exactly? For the benefit of God, it makes no sense. God doesn't need anything to his benefit. So this is what we mean when we're talking about how universal love is almost shockingly more profound than what the average person thinks of. I think, it's the idea that all of this exists for absolutely no reason. It does because God essentially just loves it, and that is it. I mean, this is, I think, what we're getting at when I keep saying that often, but I think that this is what we're getting at when we say that, when mystics talk about how they reach that level of attainment with union with God and its overwhelming love. I think that's what it's about, because um, God must also be an incredibly unfathomable amount of love in order to create something so incredible and so deeply mysterious and interconnected for absolutely no reason. I think that's kind of mind boggling and really puts life in perspective when you realize that the entirety of it is absolutely meaningless. Um, there is no reason for it to be here other than God's bemusement. So this kind of partially explains why there's bad stuff out there, um, because it doesn't matter. From God's perspective, it's all the same thing. All of it is just existence and life moving on. To believe that God actually has an opinion on something is blasphemous. It would be to contain God, and you cannot contain God. We cannot subjugate God to what we want God to be. And that's what the Fool is getting at. The Fool is entirely free. The Fool represents freedom, enlightenment, life at its purest form, and an incredibly enlightened perspective on life. So it is very much a representation of God, and of course the Fool is androgynous in Crowley's depiction, and a little bit in the Waite Pamela Coleman Smith deck as well. He's kind of an effeminate young man in her deck. And on Crowley's deck, he has breasts and slightly feminine, slightly masculine facial features, and he has the sun over his genitals. Um, the sun is associated with the phallus, etc. So he's kind of ambiguous. Um, and that's essentially what God is too. God is not even contained by gender. God transcends gender and is the progenitor of any idea of gender, essentially. And, getting back to the Sephirotic aspect, um, connecting Kether to Chokhmah, it's essentially that wisdom, Chokhmah means wisdom, um, and Kether means crown, and a crown is often what you get as a reward. If you think of the martyrs, the idea of their dying was that they would receive a reward of a crown in heaven, and so this is kind of along those same lines. Or Kether, like a crown, like an aureole that a saint has, or a halo, that sort of thing. Um, but it's almost like the reward of enlightenment is the understanding of God's wisdom to be entirely based on folly, really. That whatever God chooses to create in his infinite force in Chokhmah isn't, it has no purpose. Um, so yeah. I don't know if I talked about Aleph at all. I talked about Aleph being silent. I don't know if I said what it meant. Aleph means ox, and this is also kind of interesting because an ox is a beast of burden that, of course, is known for carrying plows. And Crowley says that the letter Aleph actually looks like a plow, and to some degree is correct. Um, so the idea is also, again, of this phallic essence, this very creative essence. Um, it's male fertility, basically, at its highest level. Um, because of course Kether being associated with motion, even though Kether as Godhead transcends gender, we conceptualize him as a male. This is why Mercury, even though he's kind of a hermaphrodite, is still a male to some extent, because Mercury and that idea of motion is considered in old, of course, misogynist thinking. It's considered masculine as opposed to feminine in Binah, which is restful and receptive to man's creative fire, water, as opposed to fire, salt as opposed to sulfur, all these old masculine feminine dichotomies that go back way, way far. Um, and of course, many feminists would would be very angry about. But it's just a way of classifying things, really, so treat it as such. But my point is that the Fool is a very masculine card, even though he's androgynous. So again, this is kind of foolish logic, but it still makes sense. Um, so being that's also kind of interesting to think about. I'm not really sure I have a point in that, um, but yeah. So in a reading, of course, this is basically how we get the usual meaning. The Fool represents innocence, in material matters, folly, and in spiritual matters, tremendously elevated perspective, basically. Um, and freedom, innocence, purity, the start of something new and spontaneous. These are, of course, very traditional meanings, but this is why they have those meanings. Um, so yeah, if you have anything else you want to say about the Fool, leave it in the as a comment below. Thank you for listening to me for 20 minutes on the Fool, and I'll see you next for number one, the Magician. Thank you and take care.